Welcome to Heavy Storytelling. We are going to be reading a story, but first we are going to be reading the Bible, and then we're going to be doing the synopsis with Kimberly, and then no synopsis with Kim.
Nope. She's elbow deep in frosting.
Oh, she's frosting did. So
she's frosted. To celebrate Christmas, she's been frosted.
Dad's gonna do. I'm gonna be doing the synopsis,
We'll see.
And then we're going to be reading Miracle on 34th Street. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell, and never miss another chicken noodle soup. Then never miss another video. Apple.
You think you're so funny. You think your brain's so big. All right, so we are on verse 121 of the 119th Psalm. This is the English Standard Version. I'm just about to begin. As soon as my children are settled. All right. I have done what is just and right. Do not leave me to my oppressors. Give your servant a pledge of good. Let not the insolent oppress me. My eyes long for your salvation and for the fulfillment of your righteous promise. Deal with your servant according to your steadfast love and teach me your statutes. I am your servant. Give me understanding that I may know your testimonies. It is time for the Lord to act, for your law has been broken. Therefore I love your commandments above gold, above fine gold. Therefore I consider all your precepts to be right. I hate every false way. Your testimonies are wonderful, therefore my soul keeps them. The unfolding of your words gives light. It imparts understanding to the simple. I open my mouth and pant, because I long for your commandments. Turn to me and be gracious to me, as is your way with those who love your name. Keep steady my steps according to your promise, and let no iniquity get dominion over me. Redeem me from man's oppression, that I may keep your precepts. Make your face shine upon your servant, and teach me your statutes. My eyes shed streams of tears because people do not keep your law. Righteous are you, O Lord, and right are your rules. You have appointed your testimonies in righteousness and in all faithfulness. My zeal consumes me because my foes forget your words. Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves it. I am small and despised, yet I do not forget your precepts. Your righteousness is righteous forever, and your law is true. Trouble and anguish have found me out, but your commandments are my delight. Your testimonies are righteous forever. Give me understanding that I may live. With my whole heart I cry, answer me, O Lord. I will keep your statutes. I call to you, save me, that I may observe your testimonies. I rise before dawn and cry for help. I hope in your words. My eyes are awake before the watches of the night, that I may meditate on your promise. Hear my voice according to your steadfast love, O Lord, according to your justice. Give me life. They draw near who persecute me with evil purpose. They are far from your law. But you are near, O Lord, and all your commandments are true. Long have I known from your testimonies that you have founded them forever. That is where we will stop for this evening with the reading of God's Word. I hope that He is richly blessing you in that reading. And thank you, one person, for joining us. We're on chapter 13 of Miracle on 34th Street. So in the last few chapters, basically what happened is there was a fiasco at the event that Mr. Sawyer was scheduled to be lecturing, and the lecture was on the mythology of Santa Claus, and he was basically saying that anybody that believes in Santa Claus is stupid, and Kris Kringle just happened to be there because he saw the invitation that was in Miss Walker's apartment, and so he went to go check it out, and of course it kind of made Mr. Sawyer a laughingstock, and he wound up inadvertently, accidentally hitting him because he was defending himself when Mr. Sawyer I can't remember exactly what Mr. Sawyer was doing. So then Mr. Sawyer decided the next day with Mr. Shellhammer, they decided that he needed to be evaluated with a real doctor, a real psychiatrist, and so Mr. Sawyer was going to set everything up. Mrs. Walker very begrudgingly agreed to it, and then to her utter dismay, yes, Kimberly helped me out, to her utter dismay, she found that Kris Kringle had been sent to Bellevue, and Mr. Gailey went to try to help him get out of there, and he found out that it is more difficult than just signing some paperwork to get a man who believes himself to be Santa Claus out of Bellevue, the institution for whatever it is, the sanatorium in New York City. All right, so now we're on chapter 13. We don't really need to add anything to that. Okay, so we're on chapter 13. And now let me go ahead and begin. Judge Henry X. Harper. I wonder what the X stands for. Probably Xavier. Judge Henry X. Harper sat in his chambers reading over some routine mail and wondering what to get his wife for Christmas. It had been a good year. Things had gone well. He would no doubt be re-elected next spring. He thought the Christmas present ought to be a little more elaborate than usual, perhaps a fur coat. Finley, his clerk, came in, Mr. Mara, from the State Attorney General's office, to see His Honor. Show him in, said His Honor, heartily. Mr. Mara entered, smiling, a folder in his hand. He and the judge were old friends. They exchanged warm greetings. Just some routine commitment papers, Your Honor, Mara told him. He placed them on the desk. His Honor started to leaf through the thick file. You'll find everything in order, Judge, said Mara. I've checked them over. The lunacy report's attached from Bellevue Hospital. Bellevue, eh? Said the judge, reading. Age unknown. An old man, is he? Yeah, very old, Your Honor. I suppose I ought to read all of this, sighed Harper. You can take my word for it, Judge. It's a cut-and-dried consent proceeding. This fellow calls himself Kris Kringle. He thinks he is Santa Claus. Oh, His Honor exclaimed with a chuckle. He reached for his pen. As he did so, Finley entered again. Mr. Gailey to see you, sir. What does he want? Asked the judge. He's an attorney. It's about this Kringle case. Better show him in, sighed the judge, and put his pen down again. Fred was polite but emphatic. He represented Mr. Kringle, the subject of these papers. In his opinion, his client was being railroaded. He requested a proper hearing at which he could bring witnesses. I thought you said this was cut and dried, said the judge to Mara. So did I, said Mara. This is the first I knew about a protest. The judge glanced at the papers again. Your Honor may sign them if you wish, said Fred, but I shall bring in a habeas corpus. Habeas corpus. Okay, thank you. I corrected myself. I shall bring in a habeas corpus in the morning. Thank you, Daniel. That won't be necessary, said Judge Harper. We'll have a hearing, 10 o'clock Monday morning. Outside, in the judge's anteroom, Mr. Sawyer sat fidgeting nervously, waiting to see Mr. Mara. For Mr. Macy had soon learned of Chris's absence, and he had quickly gone into the reasons for it. After interviewing Doris, he had called in Mr. Sawyer, and the exact words Macy had said were still ringing in Sawyer's ears. If he didn't succeed in getting Mr. Kringle released immediately, Mr. Sawyer himself would be without a vocation. His career at Macy's would be ended, and just before the Christmas bonus, too. As Mr. Sawyer sat there trying to keep from biting his nails, Fred emerged from the judge's chambers and left with a nod to Finley. Who was that?" asked Sawyer anxiously. "Mr. Kringle's lawyer," Finley told him. So Kringle had a lawyer now. Sawyer didn't like the sound of that at all. "I'd like to drop the whole case right now," he said when Mara finally appeared. But Mr. Mara, I tried to combine Mara and Moyer. Mr. Mara shook his head. "This Kringle's been committed by a city hospital. It has to go through the regular routine now." Sawyer was petrified. "Isn't there anything we can do?" he asked. "Not a thing," said Mara. "There'll be a hearing Monday morning." A public hearing? It was getting worse and worse, thought Sawyer. He asked about Mr. Kringle's lawyer. "Oh, that's nothing to worry about at all," Mara assured him. "This Gailey's just a young punk lawyer trying to get himself a little free publicity." Publicity? The word electrified Sawyer. Articles in the newspapers. That was the worst thing that could possibly happen. "I'd better talk to Mr. Gailey right away," he said as he dashed off down the hall. Sawyer caught Fred just as he was getting in the elevator. He introduced himself as Mr. Macy's representative. They were very anxious to avoid any publicity. If Mr. Gailey could cooperate, Mr. Macy would find some very generous way of expressing his appreciation. Fred laughed quietly. Mr. Macy had nothing to do with this at all, and both of them knew it. Mr. Sawyer had placed himself in the frying pan, and now he was squirming and wriggling to get out of it. "But that publicity idea," said Fred. "I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm going to need all the public opinion I can get to win this one, and publicity's just the way to get it. Much obliged, Mr. Sawyer," and he walked away. The last Mr. Sawyer saw of him was when he entered the court reporter's room. Mr. Sawyer was even more unhappy over that. The next morning, prominent items appeared in most of the New York newspapers. The story was unnatural, of course. Chris had become a celebrity, a nationwide symbol of goodwill, and now he was charged with lunacy. The hearing was front-page news. The evening papers carried even longer stories. The tenor of all the comments was the same. A radio commentator summed it up rather concisely. "These are strange times," he said. "Kris Kringle, the little Santa Claus who alone is responsible for the wave of goodwill which has swept this city, and even most of this country, is in trouble. Monday morning, ladies and gentlemen, this simple, kindly old man will appear before Judge Henry X. Harper, and he is charged with, of all things, lunacy. Incredible as it may seem, my friends, that is the fact. If bringing back the true Christmas spirit is a form of insanity, then these are very strange times indeed." At his home, Judge Harper heard the broadcast and beamed. His name was on the air from coast to coast, but Charlie Halloran, who was listening with him, wasn't pleased at all. Charlie was the treasurer of the political party which had put the judge in office. Not an office holder himself, Halloran was a potent power behind many thrones in the state and the city, an astute politician and a lifelong friend and adviser of Harper. "You look kind of run down to me, Henry," he said thoughtfully. "I think you ought to take a few weeks off." "Nonsense," replied His Honor indignantly. "Never felt better in my life." "Go fishing, go hunting, go anywhere," urged Halloran. "Why should I, Charlie?" "Because this case is dynamite, Henry," said Charlie as he switched off the radio. "You've got to get out of it some way." But Henry couldn't. It was all arranged. "Then he'd better have a sudden illness," said Charlie. "Let some other judge handle it, somebody who wasn't coming up for re-election in the spring." But His Honor was an honest man. He couldn't do a thing like that, nor did he see why Charlie should be so upset. What was the matter with getting all this good publicity? "Good!" exclaimed Charlie. "It's terrible! You're a regular Pontius Pilate before you start. You'll be every kid's little villain, and their parents will hate you too." "Nonsense," laughed Harper. At that moment, Mrs. Harper came into the room, calling her grandchildren to come and say good night. She had promised their mother they would be in bed by 8, and it was way past that already. The children came scampering into the room and gave their granny a big hug and a good-night kiss. Then they walked coldly past Judge Harper and up to bed. The judge stood there, dumbfounded. "A fine way to treat their grandfather," he said indignantly. "I don't blame them," said Mrs. Harper, as she started after the children. "Any man who'll put Santa Claus on trial for lunacy—" "You see what I mean?" said Charlie dryly, and Judge Harper began to wonder. Chapter 14. The large courtroom was packed with reporters, photographers, columnists, sob sisters, and a large slice of the general public which was avidly interested in the case. Mr. Mara, the state's attorney, slouched in his chair, sorry that he had ever been handed the case. It would be one of those dragged-out affairs. The publicity-seeking lawyer who opposed him would see to that. Kringle would now deny that he ever said he was Santa Claus. Witnesses would have to be called, depositions taken, and only 4 shopping days left until Christmas. Mara was disgusted. Now the bailiff chanted his familiar, "Hear ye, hear ye," as Judge Harper entered. Mara rose to open the case. The lunacy report had already been submitted in evidence. He now wished to call his first witness. Would Mr. Kringle please take the stand? Chris rose from the table where he had been seated next to Fred and entered the witness box. His Honor studied the old man, and he wondered to himself. Mr. Kringle certainly didn't fit the description of the senile old dolt in the report. "Good morning, Your Honor," said Mr. Kringle, beaming lightly. In spite of himself, Judge Harper smiled and nodded in return. "What is your name?" asked Mara. "Chris Kringle." "Where do you live?" "That's what this hearing will decide." This brought a chuckle from the courtroom and a scowl from Mr. Mara. "A very sound answer, Mr. Kringle," said His Honor with evident satisfaction. "Do you believe that you are Santa Claus?" "Of course," said Mr. Kringle. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Harper's face fell a long mile. Even Mara was astonished. Why, the old man was admitting his insanity. As far as the state of New York was concerned, the hearing was over. Mara turned to the judge. "The state rests, Your Honor," he said dramatically, and sat down. The whole courtroom reacted with excitement. His Honor was chagrined. His Honor was chagrined. He glanced nervously at Charlie Halloran, seated in the crowd. Good grief! It looked as if he would have to declare the old man insane. Halloran returned his glance, shaking his head sadly, telling Henry, "I told you so." Fred was on his feet now, but he seemed not a bit perturbed. He must be a little bit off the beam, too, thought the judge to himself. "Well, young man, don't you want to cross-question the witness?" "I believe he was employed to play Santa Claus," said Harper hopefully, grasping at a straw. "Perhaps he didn't understand the question." "Oh, I understood it perfectly, Your Honor," said Chris. "In view of the witness's statement, do you still wish to put in a defense, young man?" His Honor asked dejectedly as Chris left the stand. "I do, Your Honor," said Fred. "I am fully aware of the fact that Mr. Kringle believes himself to be Santa Claus. In fact, that is the basis of the entire case against him. The state declares that this man is not sane because he believes himself to be Santa Claus." "I'm afraid that's entirely reasonable and logical," said Judge Harper glumly. "It would be, Your Honor, if you or I, or Mr. Mara here, believed that we were Santa Claus." "Anyone who thinks he's Santa Claus is insane," said Mara tartly. "Not necessarily," said Fred quietly. "You believe yourself to be Judge Harper, and nobody questions your sanity, Your Honor, because you are Judge Harper." The judge suspected a veiled insult in all this. "I know all about myself, young man," he said sharply. "Mr. Kringle is the subject of this hearing. Do you still believe that you can show him to be sane?" "I do," said Fred. "If he is the person he believes himself to be, just as you are, then he is just as sane." "Of course," said the judge, "but he isn't." "Oh, but he is, Your Honor." "Is what?" roared the judge. I intend to prove that Mr. Kringle is Santa Claus. The reaction was instantaneous. This was one of the strangest offenses in legal history. How could this bland young lawyer hope to prove that Chris was Santa Claus himself? It was crazy, but it was good copy. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters dashed out to reach their phones. There was bedlam in the room. Yep. Judge Harper banged his gavel vainly and adjourned the court, but nobody except the court stenographer ever heard it. There were big stories in all the evening papers. Doris read them on her way home. She was worried. Fred was making a fool of himself, fighting a hopeless battle, and jeopardizing his job with his law firm. She wished he had never started the whole business. When Fred came over that evening, she told him so, but Fred was rather confident. All the publicity was working for him, he said. Public sympathy was very obviously behind Chris. It wouldn't be easy, but he thought he had a chance. But what about the law firm? What about his job? Doris wanted to know. Well, Doris was right, it seemed. Old Hayslip, the senior member of the firm, had called him in that afternoon. They were an old, established firm with great prestige and dignity. They couldn't have one of their junior partners making a public spectacle of himself, trying to prove that some old crank was Santa Claus. Unless he dropped the case at once, they would be forced to drop him. Well, then, you'll have to give it up, said Doris. Oh, no, I won't, said Fred. I can't now, Doris. You know that. Chris needs me. I can't let the old man down. But what about your job? You can't give that up. Well, as a matter of fact, I have already, said Fred. I told Mr. Hayslip I had no intention of dropping the case, and that was that. Now Doris was really upset. How could Fred be so quixotic? People had to be realistic about life. She had learned that. They couldn't go giving up good jobs for any sentimental whim. Fred had asked her to marry him. She had accepted happily. She loved and respected him. But when you do a crazy thing like this, well, I thought you were sensible and reliable, not a stargazer. I guess I am a stargazer, but I'm a darn good lawyer, too. I combine the best features of both, said Fred. I'll make out all right. But Doris doubted it. She doubted if he'd ever get a job again. Well, said Fred, it all boils down to this. You don't have faith in me. Of course I do, but no, you don't, Fred interrupted. Not really. You're a very factual person. You don't believe anything unless you've got proof. It's not a question of having faith in you. You're bound to lose this case. That's just common sense. Fred rose quickly. Faith is believing in things when common sense tells you not to, he replied. And you've just got too much common sense. It's a good thing one of us has, said Doris heatedly. It's rather an asset sometimes. Can't you get over being afraid? Fred pleaded. Can't you let yourself believe in people like Chris, in fun and joy and love and all the other intangibles? Doris stiffened almost imperceptibly. She became the crisp, efficient Mrs. Walker again. You can't pay the rent with intangibles, she said. And you can't live a life without them, Fred answered heatedly. At least I can't. I thought Chris and I had changed you, Doris. I hoped you'd be ready to string along with me, but I guess you're not. Doris turned away silently. Fred gave a hopeless shrug. Well, I can see there's no use talking, he said. We don't even speak the same language, do we? It's just no go, that's all. Doris stood rigidly, her back to Fred. No, I suppose not, she said slowly. Then there's nothing more to say. No. Fred picked up his hat and coat in silence. Then Doris turned with a bitter little smile. It's funny, she thought, but with all my common sense, I thought it was really going to work out this time. So did I, said Fred. He hesitated at the door, then, Good night, he said, and left. Chapter 15. The next day, the hearing was held in an even larger courtroom, and that was packed long before His Honor made his entrance. Most of the crowd was rooting for Chris. The rest were there to see what this crazy young lawyer was going to do. The hearing had caught the public fancy. Judge Harper could have filled the polo grounds, and he wished to hold court there, or had he wished to hold court there. Fred's first witness was Mr. R.H. Macy. He seemed rather uneasy as he took the oath. "Are you the owner of one of the largest department stores in New York City?" Fred asked him. "The largest," said Mr. Macy. He then identified Mr. Kringle as his employee. Did he believe him to be sane? Yes. Did he believe him to be truthful? Yes. Mr. Mara jumped up. "Mr. Macy, you are under oath," he warned. "Do you honestly believe that this man is Santa Claus?" Mr. Macy hesitated, gulped, but he quickly realized his alternative. If Chris wasn't really Santa Claus, then Macy's Santa was insane. He had no choice. "Yes," he said in a loud, defiant voice. "That is all," said Fred. On his way back to his seat, Mr. Macy's eye caught Mr. Sawyer, seated in the third row. He slackened his brisk pace slightly and glared at Sawyer. "You're fired," he said with satisfaction, and moved on quickly up the aisle. Dr. Pierce was the next to take the stand. He was the physician at the Maplewood home. He had known Chris for many years. Did he believe him to be Santa Claus? "I do," said Dr. Pierce quietly. Again Mara was on his feet. The doctor was a man of science, was he not? Had he any rational scientific reason for this opinion? The question was a boomerang for Mara. "Yes," said Dr. Pierce, "I have." Mr. Mara sat down. "Now, Fred," questioned Dr. Pierce, "did you express a wish for Christmas to Mr. Kringle several weeks ago?" "Yes," said Dr. Pierce. "What is it?" "Well, I wanted an X-ray machine for the home." Had he expressed his wish to anyone else? No. It was too fantastic. X-ray equipment is very expensive. What had arrived at the Maplewood home the day before? "The X-ray machine," said the doctor. Where had it come from? The card said, "Merry Christmas from Kris Kringle." Did he know of any other possible donor? No. What did he conclude from this? "Well," said Dr. Pierce, "when I made the wish, I said to myself, if I really get this X-ray machine, I'll believe he's Santa Claus. It came, and so I do." Next, Fred put Jim, the zookeeper, on the stand. Jim testified to Mr. Kringle's uncanny way with the reindeer. He, their keeper, could only come near them when they were tied, and he had fed them for 12 years. Yet these same reindeer walked right up to Mr. Kringle and ate out of his hand. This was too much for Mr. Mara. He objected to the whole line of testimony. It was ridiculous, irrelevant, and immaterial. Mr. Gailey was making a circus out of the court. There was no such person as Santa Claus, and everybody knew it. There was a murmur of disagreement from the courtroom. Fred said that was purely a matter of opinion. Could Mr. Mara offer any proof that there was no Santa Claus? Mr. Mara grew hot under the collar. No, of course he couldn't, and he didn't intend to. This was no nursery. This was a New York State Supreme Court. They were only wasting the court's time with this childish nonsense. Was there or was there not a Santa Claus? He asked the judge for an immediate ruling. His Honor looked very unhappy indeed. Mara had won, he feared. Officially, he could make but one decision. Then his eye fell on Charlie Hullerman among the spectators. Charlie was shaking his head violently and gesturing toward the judge's chambers. The court will take a short recess to consider the matter," announced the judge. "Look," said Charlie when they were alone, "I don't care what you decide about old Whiskerpuss out there, but if you go back and officially rule that there's no Santa Claus, you might as well start looking for that chicken farm right now. We can't even put you up for the primaries." "But how can I say there is a Santa Claus, Charlie? I'm a responsible judge. I've taken an oath. If I do, they'll have me disrobed. They'll try me for insanity." Listen, Henry, said Charlie, trying to control himself. Do you know how many millions of dollars worth of toys are made each year? Toys that wouldn't be sold if it weren't for Santa Claus? Have you ever heard of the National Association of Manufacturers? How do you think they'll like your ruling? And what about all the men they employ to make these toys? Union men! What about the AFL and the CIO? They're gonna love you, Henry, and they're gonna say it with their votes. Then there are the department stores, and the candy companies, and the Christmas card makers, and the Salvation Army. They've got a Santa Claus on every corner. You're gonna be an awful popular feller, Henry. And what about the Christmas baskets we give out? Henry, I'm telling you, if you rule there's no Santa Claus, you can count on getting just 2 votes. Yours and that fellow Mara's. His Honor shook his head sadly and raised one finger. Mara's a Republican, he said. His Honor returned to the bench with dignity and called the court to order. The question of Santa Claus, he found, is by and large a matter of opinion. Many people firmly believe in him, many others do not. The tradition of American justice demands a broad and unprejudiced view of such a controversial matter. This court intends to keep an open mind. It will hear any evidence on either side. Suppressed cheers greeted this announcement. Mr. Mara looked at Fred scornfully. Could he produce any such evidence? Yes, Fred could. Would Mr. Thomas Mara please take the stand? Who, me? Said Mara, startled. Fred shook his head. Thomas Mara, Jr., he said. A 7-year-old boy left his mother and came dashing down the aisle. Mr. Mara was completely bewildered at the sudden appearance of his son. He glared angrily at his wife standing near an aisle seat. She held up a subpoena and shook her head in a gesture of helpless innocence. By the time Mara had regained his composure, Tommy was eagerly beginning to testify. Do you believe in Santa Claus? Fred was asking him. Sure I do. He gave me a brand new sled last year. What does he look like, Tommy? Tommy pointed unerringly at Mr. Kringle. There he is, sitting right there. Mr. Mara protested feebly. Overruled, said his Honor sternly. Tell me, Tommy, why are you so sure there is a Santa Claus? Asked Fred. Because my daddy told me so, said Thomas Jr., indicating his father. A roar of laughter came from the crowd. Even the judge was grinning broadly as he rapped for order. And you believe your daddy, don't you, Tommy? He's a truthful man. Thomas was very indignant at this foolish question. Of course he is. My daddy wouldn't tell me a thing that wasn't so. Thank you, Tommy, said Fred quietly, and sat down. The crowd reacted again. Thomas Mara, Sr. rose to his feet, filled with confusion. Tommy scrambled down from the witness box and started for his mother. On the way, he passed close to Mr. Kringle. The temptation was irresistible. He leaned over to Chris confidently. Don't forget, he said in a loud stage whisper, a real official football helmet. Official, oh, it's supposed to be official. Official football helmet. You shall have it, Tommy, Chris told him, beaming, and Tommy ran happily back to his mother. Mr. Mara glanced quickly toward his son and then back to the judge. Your Honor, he said slowly, the state of New York concedes the existence of Santa Claus. This court concurs, said Judge Harper happily. He had gotten out of that one nicely. He beamed at Charlie in the crowd, and Charlie winked and smiled approvingly. Fred had made tremendous progress far beyond his wildest hopes, but he still had the major hurdle ahead of him, and he knew it. And what was far worse, Mara knew it too. But having so conceded, Your Honor, Mara was saying, we ask that Mr. Gailey cease presenting personal opinion as evidence. The state could bring in hundreds of witnesses with opposite opinions, but it is our desire to shorten this hearing rather than prolong it. I therefore demand that Mr. Gailey now submit authoritative proof that Mr. Kringle is the one and only Santa Claus. Your point is well taken, Mr. Mara, the judge said. I'm afraid I must agree. Was Mr. Gailey prepared to show that Kringle was Santa Claus on the basis of competent authority? Fred was not prepared to do so at this time. He asked for an adjournment. This hearing stands adjourned till tomorrow afternoon at 3, announced the judge quickly. Fred left the courtroom with a heavy heart. He was afraid that he was licked. What competent authority could he possibly produce? It looked as if the case of Mr. Kringle were a lost cause. And that is where we will stop, with the case being a lost cause, and we will conclude next time that we get together, which is probably, when is the first word? Next time we get together, which is probably Thursday, most likely not tomorrow. We do have Awana's tomorrow night, so we're really excited about that. And so on Thursday, we will make the first attempt at concluding this book as well as the Psalm 119. So I hope that you're enjoying the story. God bless you. Have a great night.